I was 26 when I moved to a new town for a job, and I downloaded a dating app because I did not know anyone there. I thought meeting someone new might make the place feel less empty. I did not know that meeting her would eventually lead to a photograph of myself, taken from inside those woods on the day she took me there, but sent to me months later. That is how I met Rena. Her profile was ordinary in a good way. There was a photo of her at a lake, another with a dog that was not hers, and a short bio about old cameras and quiet places nobody else seemed to care about. Nothing about it stood out as strange. We started talking, and the conversation came easily. She had a dry sense of humor, and she remembered small details I mentioned days earlier, which is rare for anyone, let alone someone you have never met in person. At the time, I thought she was simply attentive. Later, I wondered how much of that attention had actually been intentional. Over the following weeks, we talked almost every day. She told me she liked old photography, the kind you develop yourself in a darkroom, and that she had a habit of driving out to abandoned places just to photograph them. Old gas stations, closed motels, empty farmhouses. I found it interesting rather than strange. There were small things about Rena that I noticed but ignored. She sometimes knew where I had been before I mentioned it, and once she casually asked about a coffee shop I had visited that morning. When I asked how she knew, she laughed and changed the subject. I assumed she had guessed. That explanation was enough for me. Once, she asked what time I usually got home from work. When I asked why she wanted to know, she smiled and said she was only curious. I thought nothing of it. Our first few dates were in public places. Coffee shops, a bookstore, a diner that stayed open late. She laughed easily and never gave me a reason to feel unsafe. She simply avoided talking about her family. One evening, while we were talking about her photography, I mentioned that I had grown up near a forest road on the outskirts of a small town, thinking it might be the kind of place she liked to shoot. She paused for just long enough that I noticed it, then started talking normally again, saying she actually knew a forest road exactly like that from her own childhood. A few weeks after that, she asked if I wanted to see it in person. She said there was an old stretch of road that meant something to her, and she wanted to show it to me during the day, nothing dramatic, just a walk. We drove out on a Saturday afternoon. The woods were quiet and unremarkable, sunlight coming through the branches in patches. Rena walked ahead of me the entire time, and she knew exactly where to step, exactly which turns to take, as if she had walked that path more times than she was letting on. At one point, Rena stopped near an old section of broken fence and looked through a gap between the trees. I stood behind her, waiting for her to explain what she was seeing. After several seconds, she asked me to stand beside the fence. I remember thinking it was an odd request, but I did it anyway. She looked at me for a moment, then looked back toward the trees. "Do not move," she said quietly. I asked why. She did not answer. A few seconds later, she smiled and told me it was nothing. We continued walking, and I forgot about it until I saw the photograph months later. For the next few weeks, I stopped thinking about that afternoon. Then Rena sent me something that made me remember exactly where she had been looking. She sent me an old photograph. It showed a dirt road cutting through trees, the print faded at the edges the way old photographs get. I looked at it for a moment and noticed a figure standing near the tree line in the background, small enough that I assumed it was just someone out walking. I did not think much of it. I simply told her the photo was nice, then asked why she had sent it to me. She never answered that question. A few days later, she sent another photograph. Same road, same trees, but this time the figure was closer, close enough that it no longer looked like a coincidence. I compared the two images side by side. The clothes visible in the two photographs were different, and both looked like they belonged to completely different periods. These photographs had been taken years apart, and yet the same figure appeared in both of them, standing in almost the same place. When I brought this up to her, she looked at the photograph for several seconds before asking me to stop talking about it. Something shifted in the way she spoke after that, and she stopped mentioning the photographs altogether, no matter how many times I brought them up. I am not the kind of person who lets something like that go, so I kept asking. Eventually she told me, quietly, that her older brother had disappeared near those same woods years earlier, and that the photographs had come from a box of his belongings that had never been fully gone through. She agreed to take me to a small local archive that kept old county records. We found a missing person report tied to that same stretch of forest, and the name inside it matched her brother's. The report mentioned something Rena had never told me. Her brother had not been alone that night. A second vehicle had been found near the road, and an unidentified man had reportedly been seen with him shortly before he disappeared. I looked at Rena. She knew immediately that I had understood. She admitted there had been someone else, but refused to tell me who. What frightened me was not her silence. It was the question she asked next. Who else have you shown the photographs to? After that, I created distance between us. I stopped reaching out as often, and she did not chase after me. I told myself I was done with the whole thing. What I did not realize was that the story had not ended just because I had stopped talking to her. Weeks passed with almost no contact, and then her dating profile disappeared completely, without any warning or message. I assumed the strange chapter of my life was finally over. Then, months later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address and no name written anywhere on it. Inside was a photograph. I recognized the road immediately, but I could not understand why I was looking at it again. Then I saw myself standing in the background of it. It took a few seconds for it to actually register. I remember turning the photograph slightly, tilting it toward the light, thinking maybe I was wrong, maybe it was someone who just looked like me. But it was not someone who looked like me. It was from the day Rena had taken me there. I remembered exactly what I had been wearing, exactly where I had stood beside the broken fence. I remembered her telling me not to move. At the time, I had assumed she was looking through the trees. Whoever had taken the photograph had been standing somewhere behind us both, close enough to frame us clearly without either of us noticing. I did not remember seeing anyone. I did not remember hearing anyone either. The longer I stared at it, the less accidental it seemed. I brought the photograph to the police the next morning. An officer began looking into Rena, but they found very little under the name she had given me. They later told me they had found records suggesting she may have used different identities on other dating apps, though they could not confirm whether she had taken the photograph herself. They told me to contact them if anything else arrived. A few weeks later, I went back to the archive to look at the original forest photograph one more time. It was missing from the file. Someone had accessed the records after my visit. Not long after that, Rena's number stopped working completely. Her profile never came back online. It has been years since that happened, and I still have the photograph locked away in a drawer I rarely open. I never learned whether Rena had been trying to warn me about something, investigate something on her own, or use me to get closer to an answer she could not reach by herself. What still bothers me is knowing that someone had been close enough to photograph us without either of us noticing. I still do not know who took it, or why they waited months to send it. I only know that when I look at that photograph now, I notice something I missed the first time. Rena was not looking at the trees. She was looking directly at the camera. "5 years ago, when I was 26, I had been single for almost 8 months when my roommate finally convinced me to download a dating app. Nothing dramatic about it. I just sat on my couch one night, uploaded a few photos, wrote a short bio, and started swiping. His name was Daniel. I remember his profile did not stand out in any particular way, which honestly worked in his favor. No shirtless gym photos, no fish he had caught, nothing trying too hard. Just a few normal pictures and a bio that made me laugh once. We matched, and he messaged first, and the conversation just felt easy from the start. For about 3 weeks we talked almost every day. Nothing intense, nothing overly personal. We talked about the shows we were watching, bad days at work, what kind of food we liked. He asked good questions and actually remembered the answers, which I appreciated. I told him I worked in marketing. He told me he did something with logistics, warehouse scheduling, that kind of thing. We never got into anything too private. No addresses, no last names beyond what was already on our profiles, nothing like that. We finally agreed to meet in person at a restaurant downtown, somewhere busy, well lit, plenty of people around. I remember being nervous in that normal first date way, checking my makeup in my car mirror before going in. And he was exactly who I expected from the messages. Polite, a little quiet at first, laughed at the right moments. Nothing about him felt off. If anything, the date felt refreshingly normal after some of the strange ones I had been on before. By the end of it we agreed to see each other again the following weekend. At some point during that first date, I mentioned I was free that weekend and did not have any specific plans yet. I did not tell him where I was thinking of going. I had not even decided myself. The next day he texted me, just checking in, and near the end of the message he said something like, "Hey, just a heads up, you might want to avoid Miller's Creek Park this weekend, I heard there is some kind of situation going on out there." I remember staring at that message for a second longer than I should have. Miller's Creek Park was somewhere I had been quietly thinking about going with a friend. I had never mentioned Miller's Creek Park to him. I had not mentioned it to anyone either, not even in a text. I asked him how he knew I was even considering going anywhere like that, and he said something easy, something that made sense on the surface. He said his coworker lived near there and had mentioned some trouble in the area, and he figured he would just pass it along since we had talked about me being free that weekend. It was a reasonable explanation. It should have been enough. It was not enough. Something about it sat wrong with me, though I could not have told you exactly what. I did not say anything else about it. I kept my actual plans to myself and went to the park anyway that Saturday, mostly out of stubbornness, if I am being honest. Something had happened, although I never found out exactly what. There were police cars near the entrance, and people were being turned away from the park. It was enough to make his warning feel a lot less casual than it had the day before. I left without going inside. I did not text him about it. I just drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, replaying our conversations in my head, trying to figure out if I had said something about that park without realizing it. Maybe in passing. Maybe I mentioned a friend who lived near there. I genuinely could not find the moment. I went through our entire message history that night, and there was nothing. So I decided to test something, though I did not fully admit that to myself at the time. The next time we talked, I mentioned a plan for the following weekend that did not exist. I told him I was thinking about checking out a hiking trail out past the reservoir, somewhere I made up entirely on the spot. I told nobody else about it, not my roommate, not my friends, nobody. When he later asked what my actual weekend looked like, I gave him something completely different, something ordinary and boring, dinner with my sister, laundry, nothing notable. A few days later, he warned me not to go near that reservoir trail. The exact trail I had invented. The one I had never mentioned to anyone before telling him about it. I remember sitting with my phone in my hand for a long time after reading that message, feeling something cold settle into my chest that I could not talk myself out of. I ended things after that. I did not explain why. I blocked his number and deleted the dating app, blocking his profile before I did. About 2 weeks later, I received a message from an account I did not recognize on a different platform. It was him. I knew immediately, even before reading the message, just from the way it was written. He wrote about a hiding spot behind the water heater in the basement of the house I grew up in, a loose panel I used to slide my diary behind when I was 8 years old. I never told a single person about that panel, not even my parents knew I used it. I certainly never posted it anywhere. I saved that message and I went to the police. They looked into what they could. His name, his phone number, his dating profile, whatever addresses were associated with him. They found no direct evidence that he had been following me or watching me in any obvious way. I mentioned to the detective that Daniel had once commented on small details about my old apartment building, including which side of the lobby the mailboxes were on. She asked whether I knew how he could have learned those details, and when I said I did not, she checked his employment history. That search was what turned up the property maintenance company. Records confirmed he had worked for them years earlier, and that the company had serviced my building before I even moved in, giving him legitimate access to the common areas at one point. The detective was careful about how she explained it to me. She said the building connection gave them something they could actually document. But nothing in those records explained how he knew about the invented plan or the panel behind my childhood water heater. She told me to preserve any future contact and not respond if he reached out again. Not long after I spoke to the police, his dating profile disappeared. His phone number stopped working. Weeks passed, then months, with no further contact, and the investigation eventually went quiet without any real resolution. I moved to a new apartment about 6 months later, in a different part of the city, and I stopped using dating apps entirely. For the first time in a long while I started to feel like it was actually over. Then, several months later, an envelope arrived at my new address with no return name or address. Inside was a printed copy of my original dating profile, along with a small USB drive containing a digital copy of the same profile. The photos, the bio, the formatting, all of it matched the very first version I had ever uploaded, before I made a couple small edits later on. The detective examined the file with someone from the department's technical unit. The recorded creation date on the file was several days before I had even made my account. She said the date on a file did not prove when the content itself was actually created, so it was not proof of anything impossible. What she could not explain was why a version of my profile, matching my first upload down to the formatting, existed as a file at all before my account ever went live. They never determined who created that earlier copy, or who mailed the envelope. Nothing tied the file or envelope directly to Daniel, at least not in anything the police could document. They confirmed the identity he had originally given me was accurate, at least on paper, but they were never able to determine where he currently was. I never used a dating app again after that. I still think about it sometimes, usually late at night for no particular reason, and I keep coming back to the same thought, one I have never been able to shake. I do not think the app was ever how he found me at all. I think, somehow, it was how he made sure I would find him.